Hi, David.
Good morning.
How you doing?
Oh, well, very well, thank you.
It is morning, a little earlier than I'm accustomed to doing this, but I managed to get out of bed.
Congratulations. That's the kind of achievement that just starts the day off right.
And it's what made America great, is millions of people getting out of bed every day. Well, thanks for taking the time.
Oh, it's always a pleasure.
You know, the way this actually started is I was listening to a dialogue between you and Mark Schmidt, and as often happens, I was tempted to dive in and put in my 2 cents. What you two were talking about was the question of how and to what extent 9/11 anniversaries should be commemorated, and you were upset that so little was being done about it in your view, so little time and energy devoted to honoring the day, and I kind of felt like jumping into that discussion, and then
I'm conscious here that there is a certain old fart problem. I mean, I remember when I was at school that we had a teacher who was always upset that we didn't do enough on November 11th, which is the Armistice Day, which is a very big day in Canada. And I know it's here the big holiday is Memorial Day, but in Canada, November 11th was a huge thing. And once upon a time, the whole country stopped. But this was the late 70s, and the country wasn't stopping anymore, and he got upset about it. And we all thought he must have been like 172 years old. And I realize I'm now closer to being 172 than I am to the person I was then.
Well, that happens to us all every day. We're all moving toward 170, but I don't think it's actually an especially uncommon sentiment you were expressing in this case. And although I would, to the extent that I step in, I'll be on the other side of the argument from you. But then in emailing with you, I said, and also, do you mind talking about Iraq a little? And you said you would welcome it because you are doing some, I think the word you used was rethinking of your views related to Iraq, and we're planning to write something, and would welcome a critical interlocutor. And your prayers have been answered. I promise to try to be
Nothing
critical.
if not critical.
What's that?
Nothing if not critical.
Oh, well, for you I will try to summon some criticism just to assist the evolution of your writing on the subject. It's a service I perform. So maybe we could save the 9/11 thing for the end and start out on Iraq, because I mean, first of all, I really commend you, because I do think people in your ideological neck of the woods, or your neck of the ideological woods, or whatever it would be, have not talked about this as much as I would like to see. Yeah. And by the way, when I say that, I'm kind of thinking neocon broadly. I forget whether you embrace that label or reluctantly accept it or what.
I live with it.
You live with it. Okay. So they've said things. I've heard among the people who are also to whom that label is also attached. I've heard John Bolton and Richard Pearl say things like, "Well, we should have done this. We should have turned it over to Ahmad Chalabi early," and the occasional suggestion that things might have gone differently. But I haven't heard anybody who's kind of thought of as a neocon, and certainly as someone who was in the administration, as you were, rethink the thing from the bottom up, and maybe wind up still thinking it was a good idea, just badly executed. But in any event, at least do us a service of revisiting the whole logic. So I'm glad you're doing that.
Yeah, I don't want to get viewers' hopes up that I'm going to do an Andrew Sullivan self-flagellation.
That was one of the highlights of the whole history of Blogging Heads TV, was Andrew's essentially apologizing on the air for supporting the war.
Yes. Let me just preface this. I've been reading Norman Podhoretz's book, World War IV, which has gotten a lot of attention. And certainly he's somebody I'm broadly in sympathy with, and I agree with a lot of the things he has to say, and I have a great admiration for him personally. The one thing in the book that troubled me was he was very early in this, predicted a great ideological split over the war on terror, the war in Iraq. And he attributed that solely to the irreconcilability of liberal opinion. I don't think that's right. I mean, if this war had been more successful, one can cynically say there has been no such thing in history as an unpopular, successful war. If the war had been more successful, I think the country would have been more united behind it. And I think also better political management by the administration of the president could have kept not the true left on board, but much of liberal opinion. I mean, the president did not build the necessary political coalition and did not sustain it for the difficult times. He bet too much on the war being easy and didn't, therefore, anticipate the need to bring in possible political opponents. And the classic example, this is Franklin Roosevelt on the eve of World War II, when he was a little bit of a cheap political maneuver, but the week before the Republican National Convention, he called in Republicans to be Secretary of War, Secretary of the Navy, and not just any Republicans, not Joe Lieberman, but I mean, the previous vice presidential nominee of the Republican Party, and Henry Stimson. It would be the equivalent of inviting, I guess it would have been the equivalent of inviting Lieberman and Richard Holbrooke to take over state and defense. When I try to think about Iraq systematically, the way I've
But
done
wait, can I just ask you, I mean, I assume you're not saying that even if the war had gone the way it's gone, President Bush, the nation would still be real high on it, right? I mean,
no, but I think what the president could have done made it more of a national war and less of a party war, so that when it became difficult, that there would be people on the other side of the aisle who would have felt more personally invested in it. I mean, that people like Hillary Clinton cast a vote, and I mean, the secret thoughts of Hillary Clinton are, I think, probably not that different from a lot of people on the Republican side. Her secret thoughts are she understood why Saddam Hussein was a threat. She's not planning a large-scale withdrawal, as she said this weekend. And the daylight on where she is and probably where most Republicans are in this war is not that great. So why did the president not early find ways of making sure that people like her were wedded to this thing in a way that they felt a sense of responsibility, not just they were checking a box on somebody else's program for fear of the political consequences?
Okay, this leads me to want to ask maybe a question that really is kind of prior to all this that maybe we should get clear on. How badly are you willing to agree that the war has gone? My own view is that the question is whether it's the biggest foreign policy disaster in the history of the United States, and I don't really have enough of a mastery of American history to say. I'm pretty sure it's the biggest foreign policy disaster of my lifetime, which is now like half a century. And I think if you go back, I know enough about the preceding few decades to say that I think this is the biggest foreign policy disaster in the last 80 years or so. Now, where do you...
No,
how are you... I
that.
doubt you'll go along with that, but are you willing...
War not a disaster is not much of an endorsement.
Yeah, more not. Yeah. Well, let me ask: do you agree that at this point it has been very damaging to America's national security? That we are more likely to be hit by a terrorist attack because we launched this war than we would have been had we not launched it?
No, I don't. I would not agree that it's a net negative yet. But what I would say is that something that was predicated on the idea that it being an overwhelming positive achieved at a bearable cost. That even though I think the gains from the war are very real, as with everything in life.
And what are those?
The removal of Saddam Hussein from power, I think, is a big gain, and I think there's a tendency now to underestimate that.
So you think we're safer?
Let me try to do it this way because I'd like it to be more systematic about it. To say. I divide it into, when I think about this, the past, the present, and the future. Reassessing the past, reassessing where we are at present, and reassessing the future. And as I reassess the past, I still think that we need to remember better what a problem it would have been to have left Saddam Hussein in power.
Okay, what would the problem have been?
The problem would have been that in a post-9/11 world, with the United States much more engaged in the Middle East, and although we didn't know this at the time, it was not unimaginable. Because of the huge economic rise of China and India, we were going to see a secular increase in the price of energy. So Saddam Hussein, who in the 90s was a relatively marginalized figure because he was constrained not only by sanctions and inspectors, but also by oil prices of $20 a barrel, that even in the absence of the Iraq War, we would have had very high oil prices. I mean, at least probably $60 a barrel. China's gone from being the number 20 oil importer in the world to the number 2 importer in the world in the space of 15 years. And India, not as dramatic, but still similar. So there's a huge new demand for oil. He would have had a lot of revenues to play with, and he would have been in power at a time when the United States was willy-nilly engaged somewhere in the Middle East in a much more intimate way than it had been before 9/11. and where the opportunities for creating mischief and violence would have been much
So
greater.
what's an example of the kind of thing we might have tried to do and he might have thwarted us because of his wealth?
The United States would certainly, for example, have been very involved with the prospect of the Iranian nuclear bomb, and we would even if we had not been involved in Iraq, we would today still be engaged in a nuclear confrontation with Iran.
But you think we're better equipped to deal with that now when Iran has so much leverage over us in Iran? I mean, Iran's in a position where they can and presumably are to some extent trying to make our life miserable in Iran. And that seems to me to give them only more leverage at the bargaining
that
table.
gives them a lot. You know, I think one of the things in the post-9/11 world that was blocked, we didn't see because of all the flags, was how much more of a set of choice of evils we were going to have. Yes, it's true. Iran has a lot of leverage because they can threaten the American position in Iraq. But if Saddam Hussein were there, he would now, because of the confrontation with Iran, also have a lot of leverage, and he would be putting pressure on the United States, putting pressure on the Gulf Emirates. You know, if you were...
But wait, he also would not like the idea of Iran getting the bomb. It's conceivable he would do a little work for us
I'm
here.
sorry, I think that's very unpredictable what view he would have taken and who he would have regarded as his primary enemy. Remember, he flew his Air Force to Iran on the eve of the first Gulf War. That is, he was more prepared to give his Air Force to the Iranians than he was to see it destroyed by the United States. And they, of course, kept all the planes. So how he would have reacted, I mean, that's one of the things that made him such a dangerous character, was that he was kind of stupid and unpredictable. And that made him very, very dangerous. So one of the things he could complicate was he could right now, because the sanctions would not have continued, the inspectors would have lasted just as long as America could keep 140,000 troops parked in the Kuwaiti desert, which is not indefinite.
Well, that's long enough to pretty much look everywhere if you put enough inspectors in there.
Okay, all right. So let's imagine this hypothetical. Let's say Al Gore had been president, which is not a completely far-fetched scenario. Al Gore had been president, and he had done most of what President Bush did in the run-up to the Iraq War, but then at the last minute did not pull the trigger. Probably the best guess about what Gore would have done, and would have said, "I'm going to let the sanctions and inspection process continue." And the inspectors would have reported pretty definitively sometime toward the end of 2003 or early 2004, no, Iraq does not have a nuclear weapons program that we need to worry about, and its biological seem mostly squelched. Our work is done. They would have gone home. The sanctions would have just disintegrated. I mean, they were disintegrating anyway. They were largely gone. They would have disintegrated, and Saddam Hussein would have had this clean bill of health. And it would have been hard to keep the Americans parked in Kuwait, so they would have gone home. Iraq would have rejoined the world community, with oil at $60 a barrel. Saddam would have had a massive infusion of new revenues, and he would have had an opportunity to say, now what mischief shall I make? Shall I make it pointing southwestward toward the Gulf Emirates, who are now going to be... And right now, if you were a real cynic, which I'm not, but if you were, you could say one of the...
I am, so I'll do whatever you want done here. Go ahead.
Okay. One of the things that the collapse of Iraq and the rise of Iran has done has been to force all of the Gulf Emirates into a much closer relationship with the United States than they otherwise would have been. They are now there's now only one possible guarantor for those small, rich Sunni states in the region, and that is the United States. Whereas before they had a choice of two: the United States and Iraq. Now they don't.
So what do you think he would have done? I mean, I would pause and say that if things had played out the way you are saying they would have, first of all, a great precedent would have been set, which is that the world community demands to look at a nation's to examine the possibility that a suspect nation is producing nuclear arms. It is admitted, it looks, and that would be a huge precedent to set. And would strengthen our ability to look into situations like this without starting wars.
That's not nothing. I agree with you. That's not nothing. That would have been something.
And secondly, one of the things we would have learned is, I mean, you're worried about us causing mischief. I'm sure those kinds of mischiefs he could have caused. One of the things we would have learned is, wait, there is no WMD threat here. He wasn't on that track. They're nowhere near
Well, he was on that track.
Many years away from having anything we would really need to worry about.
Right. So, but he has not been on that track since the middle 1990s.
Okay. So then you're concerned about a kind of mischief he could have nonetheless caused. You're not talking about him invading countries, are you? I mean, you think he'd learned that lesson? You don't invade countries.
Sorry, no. He massed troops on his border with Kuwait in 1994 and gave every indication of rethinking a second invasion of Kuwait.
No, actually, I mean, we don't know that was anything but a bluff. What we do know...
We don't know that it was anything but a bluff, but we still had to act as if it weren't. So that the British and the United States had to fly troops into Kuwait.
Which we would do again.
Okay, but when you say, would we be better off vis-a-vis Iran, as the United States ramps up its actions to confront Iran, that it would have had to contend with the possibility that Saddam Hussein would have used our distraction to invade Kuwait. And one of the problems we would then have had, and it's exactly the same chess fork that you're now describing that we're in today, that would have been, well, how can we guarantee both the security of Kuwait and the Emirates, and even Saudi Arabia potentially, while also sustaining this confrontation with Iran? Don't we need Iraq? We'd be back in the problems we were in the 1980s, where Iraq and Iran, in a way, were able to play off the United States against each other. I mean, that the MoveOn.org crowd sees what happens there as the United States being the cynical chess player manipulating Iraq and Iran against each other. I think the historical record suggests that you had two enemies, each of which did a very good job of manipulating the United States to achieve their own ends, and each of which got quite a lot of what they wanted.
Okay, well, I would say that if your argument that we're actually better off for having fought this war depends on attaching some kind of high probability to the chance that he would reinvade Kuwait after the experience he had in the 90s.
I didn't say reinvade Kuwait. I said constantly threaten to.
Well,
I just, when you said, I'm answering here now your narrow question about leverage, and I would say, do not deceive yourself that in a confrontation with Iraq, when you say who has more leverage now, Iran, that you're right. In a confrontation, if Saddam Hussein were there, Iran would have less leverage, but Saddam would have a lot more, and that is a cost. Now you can decide whether we've made a good purchase later, but let's just do an honest tally of costs and benefits.
Well, if you think it's plausible that he would invade a country after the 1990s, which I just don't, but okay. I mean,
he invaded Kurdistan after the 1990s. The United States, Kurdistan
is within his geographic boundaries. That's within
So
Iraq.
what? The United States had a security guarantee toward the Kurds, and that was part of the deal.
But that's different from committing what is under the UN Charter transborder aggression, which is what gave us the excuse to amass an alliance and punish him so severely for invading Kuwait. These are two very different things.
Those are different things from a UN point of view, but from the point of view of the security of the United States and from the point of view of the credibility of American security guarantees and Saddam's ability to make mischief, anything he did that crossed any line that had been negotiated by the United States and Iraq and that was guaranteed by the United States, whether or not that was a line that's also of interest to the United Nations, is a problem. I mean, the United States had given a guarantee to the Kurds. There was a deal that he was to keep out of the Kurdish areas, and in 1995, sensing a moment of American weakness, he violated that deal and made a lot of headway.
Okay.
And that is the kind of thing, Bob, you just have to take seriously. That would have been happening all the time. He would have been able to ramp up his support to his chosen terrorist organizations, of which he had many, Al-Qaeda not being one, but there were others, and had been others in the past. There was a reason why every major Democratic politician of the 1990s regarded Saddam Hussein as an enormous, overwhelming problem for the United States. And let's not forget those reasons.
Yeah, I would say a lot of it had to do with not thinking clearly, but
he would have been there with 3 times the oil revenue.
Okay, but in any event, I mean, you've answered my question, which is you don't think that this war has been a disaster for America's national security.
I'm not going to deny that it's very, very costly, and that the costs are very serious.
And do you agree that one of the costs is that in an age when, terrorism is, to my mind, probably the biggest threat we face, certainly long term, when you look at the possible intersection down the road of terrorism and weapons of mass destruction. If you agree that that's the greatest threat down the road, and you can imagine how the whole thing could spiral out of control, and we could wind up with a true clash of civilizations through ill-advised policies, I would say, but it could happen. If you accept that, and you agree that a prime, if not the prime contributor to anti-American terrorism is hatred of and resentment of America, particularly in the Arab world and to some extent the Muslim world more broadly. If you accept that, I don't see how you wind up viewing the cost of this war as anything other than absolutely astronomical. So, I mean, do you not accept my premise, or is there a logical problem I'm exhibiting somewhere after my premise?
I accept your premise. I just don't go as far with it as you do. I mean, one of the things that I'm always struck by when you talk to people in the Arab world who are angry at the United States, and they are, is that their anger. The United States is guilty whatever it does. When it overthrows a dictatorship, that's bad, of course. I mean, overthrowing Saddam, that's a big grievance. Also, not overthrowing dictatorships is also a big grievance. When we don't overthrow the dictatorship in Egypt, when we don't overthrow the dictatorship in Saudi Arabia, then we are propping up that dictatorship, and that's also bad. So if the United States had not overthrown Saddam, I'm sure you would hear from people who are angry at the United States, among your crimes is your relationship and your support for Saddam Hussein, who has killed more Arabs than anybody. That I think the point to this animus, and it's real, and it's a huge problem, but whatever the United States is doing is the grievance that justifies that action.
So you subscribe to the "they will hate us regardless" school. I mean, that is a slight caricature of a school of thought that I think actually is associated with neoconservatism. It's kind of anything short of, ushering anything short of a kind of major, of a world full of democracies and the Arab region being, democracy blossoming. Anything short of what that would produce, whatever 10 or 15 years down the road, is going to leave us in a state where they hate us. And what's the difference? How much they hate us?
I wouldn't put it quite in that strong a form, but I think I do agree with that. That is that the cure for Middle Eastern anti-Americanism lies in a change in the way Middle Eastern societies work, not in a change in the behavior of the United States. That is to say, so long as the Middle East is the way it is, whatever the United States does will be a justification. Invading Iraq, not invading Iraq, either way. Because you have to say, why it? Because this hatred goes back half a century. And has been steadily intensifying over time, regardless of the various policies pursued by the United States. And I think, I don't know, Bob.
The polling data showing, that actually attitudes toward us got much more hostile in the Arab world and more dramatically in other Muslim countries. You think that data is wrong?
No, I think you're not. I think you're not quoting it correctly. If you look at, for example, Zogby International's polls conducted in March of 2002, which is a year before the invasion of Iraq, you will find that like 90% of Saudis and 85% of Egyptians have very strongly hostile views toward the United States. And the problem with this polling data is it only exists after 9/11 in any large. I think there was one or two polls before, but we only began polling opinion extensively in the Arab world after 9/11, so we don't have a good base beforehand.
But you agree in the Muslim world broadly, if you buy that polling data starting after 9/11, things got worse. There do seem to be some things in the physical universe that influence opinion toward America in the Muslim world.
Instantly after 9/11. And in fact, that what we discover is the very fact that the thing that seems to have been the decisive fact in angering the Middle Eastern opinion against the United States was getting bombed. That's the moment. It's after, and now this may be just an effect of. One of the problems with polling is people often don't have opinions until they're asked a question. And so it may be that the very act of asking, what do you think of the United States, elicits this angry answer. But we have it almost immediately, overwhelmingly hostile opinion toward the United States from the very start after 9/11. And this idea that you sometimes hear about how the world was united behind the United States after 9/11, the polling data, I just written a book about this, so that's why I have some of this at my fingertips, that even in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, you have fewer than 20% of European publics thinking that military action against anybody is an acceptable response to 9/11. And that's true, almost as true in Britain as it is in Spain. We are dealing with, I think, I'm not going to discount. Obviously, it is really important that the Middle East is full of people who are furiously angry against the United States and against Western Europe, by the way. It's not just the United States. And who justify and condone terrorism. But that was all true before Iraq. And I submit that had the United States not invaded Iraq, that you would hear today the American support for Saddam Hussein cited as a grievance, exactly as we hear American support for Saudi Arabia cited as a grievance. Whatever the United States does is the grievance. And so therefore the causes of the grievance originate elsewhere. Now, I don't mean that democracy is the answer, but I think we need to see more successful governance in the Middle East, and we need to see more responsive governance in the Middle East, and those begin to be, along with the spread of more sophisticated educational systems, those are the answer. It's not,
That would all be nice, but let me just, to get clear, take you through an alternative kind of scenario that is commonly, I mean, you're saying virtually nothing influences the amount of hatred of the United States. If you imagine a thought experiment, and you might not grant that this could conceivably happen, I don't know. If you imagine a thought experiment where we don't invade Iraq and somehow say the Israeli-Palestinian problem gets solved, at least in the sense of a stable two-state solution that the vast majority of Palestinians support, and there is a government on the Palestinian side that can control the violence, so it's a more or less stable situation. You think even that would not make an appreciable difference in how threatened America is in the long run by terrorism?
No. The Israeli-Palestinian dispute, I think, is important, but I think here we bump up into the limits of your hypothetical. I mean, if you could have an Israeli-Palestinian settlement that was accepted by almost everybody in the Palestinian territories, and where the Palestinians said, okay, that's it, we're out of the international grievance game, yes, I think that would make a considerable difference. I don't think that's a possible outcome. That is, I think you can have an outcome that is acceptable to maybe a plurality of Palestinians, but not one that reconciles the irreconcilables.
So a two-state solution is not possible in the practical world?
A two-state solution is possible. You could have, yes, that's possible. But a two-state solution that leaves enough Palestinians satisfied so as to morally discredit anti-Western terrorism, no, that's not possible.
So a stable solution is not, a stable two-state solution is not possible?
A stable two-state solution that enjoys a consensus backing among Palestinians sufficient to discredit anti-American radicalism in the in the Arab world, no, that's not possible.
And you don't agree that the Iraq War has made it, however possible you think it is, has made it even less likely? You don't think the Iraq War has lowered the chances of that happening?
An Israeli-Palestinian settlement?
Yeah, has exerted a radicalizing influence on Palestinians.
I tend not to believe that, no.
And what about the dispersion of terrorist technologies thanks to Iraq? It's become a proving ground, and we know that stuff has moved in various places, including Afghanistan. It's killing our troops in Afghanistan. I mean,
I promised rethinking here, so I don't want to say that I'm not going to agree with anything you say. Yeah, look, when I say what are the costs, what are the problems? It costs in terms of human life, American human life and Iraqi human life, much, much more than expected, predicted, and on the Iraqi side, I've been skeptical of a lot of the estimates, like the Lancet estimate and the new one, but I mean, the government's estimates do look wrong, and we were talking about hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians probably, and now many more in exile. Huge problem, and 3,000 Americans dead and many, many wounded, and
if I could just interject, the hope for a long-term stable democracy in Iraq, when you strip off the 10% of the population that is probably best educated, right, and they go to another country, I mean, your dream world of a stable democracy in Iraq seems to me way less probable.
And my guess is that they probably accumulated all kinds of probably quite legitimate grievances and resentments of the United States that are going to make it very difficult, even when Iraq gets together, for that educated elite to work happily with the United States in the future. So that's a big cost. And your point about the diffusion of technology is bang on. That's a big cost. And the discrediting of American military power. The United States looks less imposing and threatening than in the eyes of its enemies than one would once have wished. That's a big cost. And the mangling of the relationship with important allies, some of which was maybe a lot of that relationship was just handled in ways, and there's blame on both sides, but we're looking at the people on our side. I mean, I don't know why, when you disagree with friends of yours, you have to then abuse them at the same time. And Chirac and Schroeder behaved very badly, but the United States could have responded in a more statesmanlike way and accepted that and remembered that they won't be there forever. So all of those things.
So you were never calling French fries freedom fries personally when you you didn't go that far.
There are moments I did worry in the period from about 95 to about 03, whether or not it was legitimate to call the French real allies in the sense that the other European powers were. And that's a question that Vice President Cheney asked the French ambassador, in what sense is France an ally? Now, what happened after 2003, ironically, was the level of intelligence cooperation between France and the United States began to improve, and France has a particularly good and capable intelligence service. And interestingly, the French Islamic population is, if the polls are right, the least radicalized in Europe. So they have the best recruitment inside Muslim or Middle Eastern immigrant communities, and they have a lot of information, which they use very effectively. And so, you know, I may have said one or two things in the heat of the moment in 2003, but I've been.
But the phrase "freedom fries" may have come out.
No, not that. That's childish.
So we've established that you do not agree with me that this war was a disaster. You apparently don't even agree that, on balance, it was a bad idea so far. That's not even.
No.
In other words, well, no. I want to be clear. I'm not asking you to. I wouldn't expect you to agree it was necessarily a bad idea. But
here's where I will agree. Are we approaching a point where the costs inflicted by this war are coming to equal the benefits? And I think we have to. I don't know how you compute that exactly, but the costs are huge and large, and we're radically underestimated and continue to grow. I will agree with that. And now we have a problem. So yes, that is a big problem, and I think it darkens the reputation of everybody involved with the planning of the war. You know, and I tend to agree, as I look back on it, that one of the ways we got trapped here was General Zinni, the Pentagon, General Shinseki, and also, it should be said, Bill Kristol and Bob Kagan were all right that this war was going to take a lot more troops than Donald Rumsfeld and company wanted to believe. It was also true that Richard Perle and the neoconservatives were right, that it was reckless to invade Iraq without having an Iraqi provisional government ready to go. The idea that you launch this war in order to install Paul Bremer as proconsul, and that decision was made, as Paul Bremer tells us in his memoirs, he got the call 11 days after the fall of Baghdad. So you arrive in Baghdad, and for 11 days you still don't know how you're going to govern the place. That strikes me as reckless, and that, I think, is the core of Richard Perle's criticism, and that is also right, along with the Shinseki-Zinni criticism. You know, that kind of bad management gets secretaries of defense and presidents and political parties fired.
Okay, can I just briefly challenge the idea that bad management was the problem, although there was a lot of bad management? Here's something I've never understood about specifically the neocon scenario, because the neocons emphasized democracy so much, okay? You had, on the one hand, the idea was clearly to have a long-term presence of American troops in the aftermath of the war, and these troops would serve America's strategic interests and be an instrument for executing our foreign policy, okay? There's no doubt about it. I mean, right after Baghdad fell, the Weekly Standard, generally identified as neoconservative, had this piece called there's what is something like "There's no place like Iraq for American troops," specifically sketching out that they wanted a Guantanamo-like arrangement. In other words, long-term lease, decades. Okay, so there's no doubt that was part of the neocon plan. On the one hand, it was going to be a military platform for the United States. On the other hand, it was going to be a democracy. Okay, now, so what you're assuming there, if you really mean the part about democracy, and being a democracy, of course, goes well beyond, having Chalabi ready to inherit the reins. We're talking about having an election and seeing how people feel about Chalabi and all the things he's advocating, okay? So the neocon premise was, you're going to have these American troops there. Iraq is going to be a platform for the exercise of American power. Iraq is going to be a democracy. And so they must have been thinking, well, everything we do with those troops and will be fine, inclling leave them there. All of this will be fine with the Iraqi people.
That's a powerful point. You're right about that. Those two things probably were contradictory.
Well, if you look at who our allies and adversaries are in the Middle East, I would say that idea begins to enter the realm of crazy. I mean, certainly, is it conceivable you could work it out so that you win the favor of the Iraqi people? And an Arab Muslim nation that, in addition to being an Arab Muslim nation, has a big population with a strong emotional attachment to Iran and so on. You know, it's conceivable, but the idea that it's likely to happen strikes me as crazy, and that idea was at the heart of the neocon plan, unless I'm mistaken, David.
Different people had different thoughts. I agree with you. I mean, to my mind, always the most important thing you would get out of Iraq was political, not military. And the United States does not lack for bases, not even in that region. And the efficacy of troops in the Middle East is so limited that I don't know if you have a lot of bases what exactly you're going to get. And that having a responsible and accountable political regime in Iraq was such an enormous prize that why you would put it at risk for basing rights, that never made sense to me. But I don't think it is inconsistent to say that the United States should have arrived with a provisional government ready to go, and that it also should have supported elections 18 months or so after the provisional government took over that might have had the effect of either ratifying or not ratifying that provisional government. But you're not going to have elections in the first 10 days. And somebody has to govern Iraq from the moment Saddam goes. And if the choice is Paul Bremer, then Ahmed Chalabi looks like a better choice. And if you don't like and one of the things I think that was a tragedy that went wrong in the Bush administration, this is a joke I often made at the time, and now it's not so funny. But that we had this situation where the civilians at the Department of Defense thought that Ahmed Chalabi ought to head the provisional government, and the CIA and the British preferred Iyad Alawi. And the State Department and many of the Arabists thought that the right man was Adnan Pachachi. Chalabi, Pachachi, Alawi, just pick one of them. Any one of them is better than Paul Bremer. If you don't like Chalabi, fine, pick somebody else. I mean, Chalabi had gone to the trouble of building a political organization that was as representative as there was in the exile community, and it supported him as its chosen leader. But the United States is supplying the firepower, so it has a say in this too. Okay, make it Adnan Pachachi if you like. And where there was a breakdown was, and this is one of the things I really blame the Bush administration for, and myself as part of it, to the not very grand role I played there. But it's the job of the National Security Advisor to say to the President, Mr. President, you have a set of options here. And you can choose any one of them, but you must choose one of them by no later than next Tuesday. And I'll be back on Tuesday to remind you that today is decision day. And that decision was just allowed to drift, with the result that the invasion went ahead, as we see with not enough troops, at the same time as the political process completely disintegrated, and the partisans of Alawi, Pachachi, and Chalabi fought it out to a draw, up to up to the day after Baghdad fell, up to 10 days after Baghdad fell, at which point the decision was made, okay, we'll have an American proconsul, and that was just so obviously and predictably a disaster.
I agree that it was not a well-executed aftermath, to say the least. But back to my argument that it was just intrinsically a bad idea as it was being conceived, again, the way it was being conceived was A, democracy, B, platform for American troops. Now, you just said that actually you had doubts about the American troops part. So I have two questions. One is, did you express these at the time, or maybe you were in the White House and didn't feel free to express them? I certainly don't remember a lot of dissent coming up from the neocon ranks, like, oh, maybe we should pull the troops out as soon as possible. Secondly,
I will say,
but let me finish. I mean, secondly, leaving aside what you did or didn't say, you knew that what we were going to do was go in there and try to do both of those things, unless you knew something I didn't know. So if you supported this war plan as it was being conceived by this administration, which you did, you were supporting a plan that you now agree had a major contradiction at the heart of it, which you say you acknowledge, right?
For my own personal role, I was in the White House until March of 2002, and it would be difficult to underestimate how unimportant. It would be difficult to overestimate how unimportant a person I was. But in my writing, for what little weight that had, in the book I wrote with Richard Pearl, An End to Evil, we were very strong voices, and this is in print, in favor of a light footprint in Iraq. And that would mean no Bremer, get the troop numbers down as rapidly as possible, have a maximal Iraqi role, and do not think about a prolonged American presence, because the securing of this new government is your supreme priority. So you say, okay, well,
when that
wasn't the plan, when you discover that's not the plan, how do you respond to that? And I think the way I respond to it is by saying, well, since this war is going forward, let us continue to fight within the coalition for what we think is the right kind of approach. And now there are people who will say, who now say, and I think Richard may be at this point, that if he had known how utterly his version of how the war was to proceed was going to be rejected, he would then have opposed the war at the start. I don't know if that's his considered view, but he said that in various press interviews. I think at moments, perhaps at emotional moments, I don't know whether he would back that view. But there are other people who have said similar kinds of things. I know Michael Ledeen, for example, who was never that crazy about the invasion of Iraq. He always thought that Iran was the top priority anyway. But a number of them have said, if I'd known that the people on the wrong side of this. But one of the things and this is a very bitter irony, is precisely because that you attribute a kind of clarity of, you say, when you look at the plan being contradictory, you say, aha, there's a clear contradictory plan. I think the way it actually was experienced at the time is because it was so blurry, because it was a constant struggle between people who wanted to do things different ways, that people continue to join this bureaucratic battle, believing that they could push the policy in the direction they wanted to go. And I think, if you want to talk, I don't usually think it's helpful to talk in terms of neoconservatives and so on. I think it's always best to use the names of individuals rather than the names of amorphous groups that may or not exist in the way that outside people do. But
actually, once the term has acquired a certain stigma, I love to apply it to people who disagree with me. So I'm going to keep using it. But if it's okay with you.
You go ahead. As a term of abuse, fine. But as an analytic tool, I don't know that it's very helpful to say the neoconservatives thought this. I'd rather say Paul Wolfowitz thought this and Richard Pearl thought that.
Well, but you use labels. You use terms like conservative and liberal. I mean, labels are in fact useful, as imperfect as they inevitably are in the world of intellectual taxonomy.
But in understanding how government bureaucracies work, they can often be kind of confusing. But here, I would say, if we're going to use the term, that maybe the tragedy of this war, not the tragedy, but a Washington bureaucratic tragedy of this war, was that that the neoconservatives had enough power to get political power, bureaucratic power, to get the ball toward war rolling, but not enough then to actually control the way it was going to move, and never to have direction of them. And so the result was that you had a war that was launched on the assumption that certain things were going to happen in the aftermath, and then directly opposite things happened. And you put in motion a kind of failure machine, because that if you were going that you set in motion a policy where it accrued a lot of additional goals, which guaranteed the disappointment of some of the main goals. And as you say, the basing is one of them. If you're going to use Iraq as a base. And that was tried in the 50s when Arab politics were much more traditional and people were much more tractable, and elites had much more power inside the Arab world. And it didn't work in the 50s. So if it didn't work in the 50s, why would you expect it to work in 2003?
Okay. So I gather, I was curious as to what you meant when you said you were doing some rethinking of Iraq. It sounds like it's not very fundamental. I mean, in the I don't mean you didn't go through a fundamental process of thought, but I mean in terms of premises and assumptions of yours that you are now amending. I gather we're not talking about a radical restructuring of your worldview, and I gather that among the
as I say, I don't want to overpromise you. What I've been doing is trying to think why did things go so badly wrong,
and you subscribe to the view that it was just badly executed.
No.
Well, actually, no. It's a little more complicated. You're also now agreeing that it was a blurry plan that you supported, and you were kind of hoping it would clarify in the direction of your preferences.
Right, and I think that's probably not a good way to do things. And I think what I would also say about that is I think I blame a lot of the political management. I don't think we took the difficulties of the war seriously enough. We believed it would be too easy, and so we didn't build a proper political coalition in the United States. I have a lot of things to say about the way the war was financed. I mean, I can't. I think that one of the
You're a fiscal conservative, right?
Yeah, but like whatever you are, the fact that the president supposing you think that a tax increase is the single stupidest idea that the United States could do, but you also know that the Democrats in Congress, who are a big bloc, that for them having a gas tax was essential to committing them to the war. You have to give them something. You have to give your opponents something, and you have to give your opponents something they really want if you're going to bind them into your coalition, and that didn't happen. And as we go forward, one of the things that, as I look forward, and this is probably the place where my thinking does get a little bit more radical. I mean, I am very anxious about the interpretation that's being given to the seeming success in Anbar, because what is happening in Anbar, in many ways, is a repetition of what went wrong in the early planning of the war, which is that the United States has gained. It hasn't built it, it hasn't earned it, but it's gained this remarkable local political success in which the United States is not the mover. The United States is the beneficiary. That is local people, for their own reasons, breaking with Al-Qaeda and doing things that look like they're the kind of things the United States wants. And what is happening is that this seeming tactical success is ending up driving the American strategy. That we're in danger of losing a clear understanding of what it is that we're trying to do, and letting a seeming success push us now down a new path, where the United States is going to find itself in association with a lot of the most primitive.
A path that's going to lead to the fragmentation of the country, very likely, right?
Yes, and it's also it's a path that also makes Americans very beholden to the Saudis and to other Gulf states, because that you're staking your success in Iraq on the cooperation of people who are very amenable to pressure from the traditionalist Sunni world, and you're turning your back on a lot of the most westernized elite, now much of it in exile, in order to do deals with these Sunni sheikhs. And it is that you're forgetting what you wanted to do, and you're just opportunistically following up a seeming success.
Well, what you wanted to do started seeming less plausible than it might have at one point some time ago, I think. I mean, we're just looking at things that seem like they may lead to short-term stability and try to take them as far as they can go. And I'm not sure at this point that that's a stupid idea.
It's not. I don't think when you have a really hard problem, as we've had in the whole Middle East since 9/11, very few of the ideas are stupid. I mean, even the smart ones, even the ones that are wrong, are often very smart. And I think one of the things I think is often sort of helpful when you look at foreign policy to distinguish is a lot of people who are smart, a lot of people who are wrong are smart, and a lot of people who are right sometimes just turn out to have been lucky. I mean, they just put their chip on bad analysis, but it happened to be that they guessed right, and there are no shortage of examples of that, and one can think of them even in one's own life, where you have predictions that turned out to be right, but not for any good reason.
Well, speak for yourself. With me, it's always prescience, David.
Okay. Well, I would say where in the past where I've guessed things right, I can't claim any great credit for wisdom into it. I just happened to say something, actually, and it just happened to coincide with the way things turned out. So we now have this. I mean, we are at a point in Iraq now where we need to think very hard. What is it that the United States hopes to salvage from Iraq, to accomplish here? How does the United States achieve American ends? And I am terribly worried that we are going to be opportunistically subordinating America's strategy to this tactical success, and will end up serving other people's ends.
So you would like us to continue to pursue the political unity of the country as an overarching goal?
No,
what do you want us to do?
I think that that is really going to be impossible. And anyway, it's not.
So partition per se. I mean, is the actual division of Iraq into separate countries in the cards, or a loose federation, or what?
I think we've seen the disintegration of central authority, and it's beyond the capacity of the United States to sustain that central authority. And so I think you have to. I think we're going to see the country come apart, and I think the United States is then going to be in a position where it's going to need to think about what, in the context of this disintegration, what are its top goals. Where you have friends, as you do in the Kurdish region, you want to protect those. You want to maintain the ability to deploy American power where you see the appearance of Al-Qaeda sheltering enclaves. But you want to be very, very careful about who you choose as real allies and putting lots of weapons, for example, in the hands of these Sunni sheikhs in the West because they're today's friends, strikes me as a kind of short-sighted policy. And so too does taking any kind of side in the looming Sunni Shiite shakedown. That I don't know that the United States wants to have its fingerprints on that fight. And the United States, when it destroyed Saddam, may have opened up this possibility. But the United States is not the country that is at fault here, because there are lots of opportunities for Iraqis. The United States has given them that to come to a more peaceful understanding. If they don't, in some ways that's going to be their choice, and the United States does not need to be guilty of or implicated in what the worst possibilities that may happen, and it should not be picking friends and enemies in that fight, because those are not friends and enemies that the United States needs to have.
So I mean, but I'm not sure what positive prescription I heard there. I may have missed something.
The positive prescription is...
So keep Kurdistan safe, but you're not saying put all of our American troops in Kurdistan and then wish everybody else well,
no,
right?
I'm saying, but what I am saying is that the United States needs to be, I would say, drawing troops out of most of Iraq into Kurdistan and into Baghdad, and it needs to be retaining more of a capacity to intervene. But I think the key idea behind the surge of the United States as the day-to-day guarantor of security in Iraq, I think that's been exposed as unworkable. And I don't quarrel with the decision to try it, but I think we now have enough information to know, that's not really going to work. And since it's not going to work, there comes a point where you have to say, that we're not going to be able to sustain. The political stability of Iraq is going to be a problem for Iraqis to work out. What the United States can do is it can protect its friends, it can protect the capital, and it can protect the oil fields, because those are important. And I know that it's sort of considered in bad taste to mention that, but that is an important consideration.
Actually, could I go off on a little hobby horse here? The presence of oil in the Middle East has been used as an excuse for a lot of stuff I'm not enthusiastic about, including invading Iraq. My view, and there's this fear that if the bad guys get a hold of the oil, what will happen? Or suppose, radicals take over in Saudi Arabia, and the bad guys are in control of the oil. Well, my understanding of the way market economics works, it would be one thing if all the oil were in one country. But my understanding of the way market economics works, when you have any kind of at all diffuse distribution of this resource among different countries, including Venezuela and blah, 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 is that, okay, I'm going to assume they're all going to sell it and try to make money off of it. In fact, one of your great concerns is that bad guys will use it to make money. They're all going to sell it to somebody. So, and it doesn't really matter whether one or two countries say, we're not selling it to the United States, because it's a world oil market. Now, granted, if all of the countries with oil say, we're not going to sell it to the United States, and by the way, choose to accept the reduced price that would imply, if they all did that, that's one thing. But the idea that if bad guys in one or two countries with a lot of oil assume power, that's bad for the United States. I just think that's crazy. They will sell it to someone, so the world oil price will not change, and we will find someone to buy oil from at that price, right?
Not exactly. Up to a point, like copper. I don't think you can call an idea crazy when it's won the assent of absolutely, or almost absolutely everybody who's looked at it from all political points of view over a period of half a century.
Almost everybody wanted to invade Iraq.
Sorry. So going back to the 1950s, from Democrats and Republicans and laborites and conservatives in Britain and Gaullists and socialists in France, and experts of almost every denomination over a long period of time. Let me point out a couple of things that complicate this picture. And maybe from some very long-term perspective, there's much truth in what you said. It's also true that oil poisons the politics of the countries where it's found. I think of the top 5 oil exporters, maybe even of the top 10, the only one that's anything like a stable democracy is Norway. The rest, they're not in the Middle East, but Venezuela, Russia, Nigeria, these countries are no bargain either.
I agree. It's bad. It's bad. Oil is a curse. I agree.
One thing, the two consequences the United States needs to be very worried about. One is because of the tendency of oil to disrupt and disorient politics and to foment radicalism, you're always worried about a supply disruption caused by political instability of a kind that could have happened, that you could very easily have imagined. If in 1979 those radicals who tried to take the Grand Mosque in Mecca at the same time as the Iranian Revolution were proceeding, those people, they wanted ultimately to sell, of course. But in the short term, what they would have done is over the next they could have caused enough chaos that over the next 2 or 3 years, the supply situation is wrecked. Iraq is.
Well, we just did that very thing in Iraq. Major supply disruption. The world is still around.
But the point is, the Iraqi,
that whoever inherits power, it's in their interest to end the disruption of supply.
Maybe. But one of the reasons that the Iraqi oil exports have been so disrupted for so long that even now Iraq is not exporting significantly less than it did under Saddam Hussein, because back then too it was underperforming its potential. Iraq is full of corrupt people who would love to sell the oil, but they're not able to because there isn't political stability. And it is very easy to imagine a Middle East where that problem spreads much wider, and where there are a lot of corrupt people who'd like to sell, but they just can't because there's too much violence, because there are too many people trying to be the corrupt holders of the oil reserve. So that's one thing that we've always been very worried about, is what if you just can't sell it because the docks are blown up and then people are being shot and there's violence, and it's not just in one particular place but over the region.
I'm not among those who advocates inducing instability
but it happens,
in the Middle East.
It happens whether you want it or not. You don't control it. And the second concern is how they use the money is really important. It's estimated that the Saudis have spent $70 billion, and these are our friends, supposedly, of their money fomenting radicalism worldwide as a way of keeping some of their domestic problems at bay. That $70 billion of dawah spending has been a huge security problem for the United States. So is the use that Iran makes of its money. So yes, they're selling, but the use they have of the money is a very, very big concern. And the use that Saddam Hussein made of his money was a huge concern, and the use he would have made of the money that he would have had he held power with oil at $60 a barrel today, that I think is also a concern. You have to worry about those things.
I agree that great resources, vast concentrations of natural resources are conducive to authoritarian rule. I agree with that part. But the argument that is often trotted out is if we don't keep troops, on the Arabian Peninsula, we will not be in position to intervene should bad guys take over in an oil-rich country. And I'm just telling you, bad guys are going to want to sell the oil. It's not a long-term threat of energy disruption to the United States. It is often cast that way.
A 24 or 36-month disruption, which is a very, very plausible scenario, that's a big problem. And how secure do we think the government of Saudi Arabia really is anyway?
Okay, but let me just briefly get back to the thing we agree on, which is that authoritarian countries are not. We'd rather they weren't there. Transition toward democracy is a good thing, and oil wealth complicates that because it concentrates power in the hands of a few, and so on. I really think that neocons underestimate the extent to which, if they want democracy to spread, the extent to which the current phase of technological evolution is already on their side. And just in today's paper, I was reading about, Burma, now known as Myanmar, and these encouraging pro-democracy demonstrations by Buddhist monks. I was reading the piece. I thought, I know this has something to do with the proliferation of these kind of empowering technologies, whatever, cell phones, blah, blah, blah. And sure enough, there was the paragraph about photographs, video, and audio files carried rapidly by technologies, including the Internet, that the government has failed to squelch. And I just think that if an authoritarian wants to insulate himself from that, he has to go as far as North Korea has gone and basically condemn, a country to just a long-term implausible degree of isolation. But in any event, in the Middle East, that's not what we have. Those countries are more porous. You're seeing the information technology at work, and I just think we are crazy to step in and short-circuit that process at the kind of costs we have paid in Iraq, rather than subtly abet it and cheer it on. But that's
let me just throw two disturbing thoughts at you that I worry about. I think it's true that the ability of authoritarian governments to hold on to power has weakened. The difficulties, however, in creating non-authoritarian systems are as great as ever, the cultural habits and so on. And that is certainly, if that's not a lesson of Iraq, I don't know what is. But the second the second worrying thing is I don't think in the Middle East that the violent extremist terrorist movements that you've seen are reactionary and backward-looking movements. I think in many ways they are progressive, and that they are part of the crisis of the encounter with modernity that's hitting the Middle Eastern world. And I have no truck with those who have some special condemnation of the Middle East and Islam for this. I mean, you look at China's transition to modernity, Europe's, that it's been a pretty horrible process just about everywhere. But it's happening there now. And what you're finding is a lot of people are saying, I'm not going to listen to some elder who tells me that the Quran is about this or that. I'm going to make my own understanding of the Quran, and I read it, and it tells me to act on these angers and resentments I have because of what I see on my dish TV.
You're saying that's happening now. There's a more...
So I think that the same and
the interpretation of Scripture is less mediated by authority than it used to be.
And the same anti-authoritarian technologies that you see as weakening the grip of reactionary leaders of the past, that's probably true. They also empower the nihilistic violent of today. And
well, I would say in lots of ways, absolutely. I mean, I've been writing for some time about what I call the growing lethality of hatred for exactly that reason. In various ways, information technologies make it easier for amorphous grassroots hatred to assume organized form, as it did on 9/11, and kill a lot of people. And we haven't seen anything yet, because down the road there is the possible intersection with true weapons of mass destruction and so on. But that's the reason I think the cost of the Iraq War has just been so massively unacceptable, which you don't agree with. And I'm just emphasizing here that the idea you just stressed, that information technologies make it easier for grassroots hatred to morph into lethality, that for me is reason number one that invasion was a bad idea.
I tend to think that these hatreds have a lot more. The hatreds were there, and I think that the very evidence you rely on to show the increase in the hatred post-Iraq shows exactly the opposite of what you think. That it shows that this was a huge problem before the invasion of Iraq. It was a huge problem immediately after 9/11, probably even before. And I also think that that it's very hard to compare the cost of the path you're on to the cost of the path that you didn't take. But I think that path, the leave Saddam there path, the costs of it are not being accurately accounted in the polemical atmosphere at the moment. And I just want to say, as the last thing to show that this duty of rethinking I take seriously. I'm prepared for myself as part of an administration to say, we really did a lot of things wrong, and we're going to pay a political price for that, and that's the American way. And all of us who have been associated with this are going to carry a black mark upon us for through much of our policy career because of this, and that's probably deserved, and that's something whether you played a big part or a small part, if you were involved in this, it didn't turn out well, and had it turned out brilliantly, we would all have been crowing it. We would all have been claiming credit, even though we might have been wrong or unimportant. So when it doesn't turn out brilliantly, we get a black mark. But that doesn't obviate the difficulties of correct analysis of what happened, what exactly went wrong, what lessons are to be learned, and what we do now. And the idea that, okay, well, we'll just close the book on it and withdraw from Iraq, and then everything will be okay, that path, too, you have to account for the costs are, and they are enormous.
No, I'm pretty sure everything's not going to be okay no matter what we do. At the beginning we promised, or I promised, that we would get back to the discussion that actually led to the email exchange that led to this. And so I want to at least briefly say something about that. We've gone a little over an hour, but we could go on about this, and we should in the future. But this issue of commemorating 9/11, the thought I had when you were, you and Mark Schmidt on Blogging Heads were, it was, I guess, being taped on either 9/11 or 9/12, and you were saying, and you were disappointed that there hadn't been more in the way of solemn commemoration, I guess, and Mark was less disappointed, and his reason was that, I would. We should all honor it in our own way, but one reason I gather, I hope I'm not misstating his view. One reason he didn't see eye to eye with you on this was that, in his view, the Bush administration and people of your ideological ilk, if he wasn't necessarily attacking you personally, but had in his view exploited 9/11 and the commemoration of it to advance policies that he thought were bad.
His exact
and he thought
words,
the administration had done so very crassly.
If I recall correctly, his exact words, which I found kind of amazing, were that in his mind, what has happened since 9/11 is almost as great a tragedy as the events of that day itself. And I was sort of stunned by that. I was grateful to him for saying it, though, because I think he helped me to clarify, in my mind, how, and to understand better how a lot of people of a different point of view feel. And at the time when he said that, I was angry. I was sort of shocked and angered by it. I'm prepared, sort of in retrospect, to say, in sort of the solemn spirit of the day, that I'll accept some responsibility too on my side of the aisle. That people who are not irrational, and Schmidt is a very serious-minded and intelligent person. If he could feel that way, then I think maybe there's some inward looking to say, well, did people on my side, did we do things to justify those kinds of feelings, as appalling as we may find them?
And what is it that, he didn't put it the way I would have, because for one thing, the word tragedy is such a mushy word that I never know what people mean by it.
I urged him to use the word atrocity.
What's that?
I urged him to use the word atrocity. It's a war crime, what happened on 9/11.
Okay, but what was it that that so appalled you about the way he put it?
However, I suppose because I attach enough importance to the idea of national unity, national identification, to say, however, let me put it this way, however angry you are at the Bush administration, don't let it turn you into a Charles Lindbergh. Into Charles Lindbergh. Don't let somebody who...
Well, that's going pretty far. Who was veering in that direction when you had that thought?
Don't let your alienation from the practices of your government of the moment put you into a situation where you lose sight of the loyalties you owe to the national community ahead of those feelings you may have against the government of the moment. And I'm not saying this is a universal problem. And I wrote an article about it for National Review in 2000. There are a lot of conservatives who in the 1990s were so alienated from the America they saw that when 9/11 happened, some of them were not as upset about it as they ought to have been. I'm prepared to volunteer on behalf of my fellow conservatives if they want it, or I'll just speak for myself to say that if things the Bush administration has done, the way it has behaved since 9/11, have caused so much alienation that it could drive people to those kinds of feelings, then that we have a lot to answer for. On the other hand, that doesn't make those feelings any less shocking or unacceptable.
Well, but I'm sure Mark wouldn't say that, gosh, I'm so outraged that I'm letting go of my feelings of national loyalty, as you seem to put it. I'm sure he views it as part of his loyalty to the nation and its interests that he not play along with what he views as an unfortunately successful propaganda effort. I think that's what he's saying. The idea that his response was kind of unpatriotic or something. Maybe it wasn't nationalist enough for you.
It was alienated. I didn't say, and when I say, I think that I find that alienation shocking. But I also am. I think it calls for some soul searching on my side of the aisle to say, okay, well, if that alienation is there, we need to. And since we were the power holders, we need to think hard about what we've done to have caused it. And so I think it's a question of the. What was interesting to me about that conversation was my immediate reaction was shock, and my considered reaction was to do more soul searching about the attitudes and expressions that you've heard from our side of the aisle, and as I said, to have wished that this president, this administration, I myself, in my unimportant way, had done more to make sure that the United States approached the post 9/11 world in a greater spirit of national unity.
Okay, let me quickly tell you what I was actually thinking as I watched that exchange. I was thinking, first of all, I was thinking, well, of course David Frum wants more in the way of widespread and solemn commemoration of 9/11, because thinking about 9/11 summons the kinds of impulses, and I would say not necessarily rational ones, that tend to support the kind of policies you've supported. I mean, you wanted to invade Iraq. That is, and invasions of countries are abetted by strong feelings of retribution. Of course, in this case, the retribution was premised on what I would argue was a complete misconception, which is that Iraq had that attacking Iraq was in any way attacking those who did 9/11. But in any event, I think you would not deny feelings of retribution, sustained, support for that war, and commemoration of 9/11 of a certain kind inevitably summons feelings of retribution, because you're reminded that somebody inflicted this terrible atrocity on you, and retribution has its place. But I think it should always be under rational governance, because the emotion itself of retribution can mislead us, as it did in this Iraq war. So that's what I would have said. I wasn't surprised at all that you want to dwell on this atrocity, and Mark is less inclined to, because getting the nation to dwell on it is more conducive to policies of the kind you like.
Well, there's no question that I think that one of the ways that liberals and conservatives differ on this is that, while we all concede the element of sadness, that I think conservatives do tend to emphasize more also the element of national humiliation and dishonor, and the retributive element, for sure. I mean, I think that's a crucial part of what 9/11 is about. Just as I don't think the proper reaction to Pearl Harbor was one of mourning only. The reaction of Pearl Harbor was a retributive one, and most of the energy of that retribution fell on the Germans, who had nothing to do with it. They didn't attack Pearl Harbor, and yet we invaded Europe anyway.
Well, yeah, but I would say that was a good idea in contrast to the Iraq War.
But I don't know. But I don't know. But there were people in December of 1941 who were worried that the United States would, in its righteous wrath against Japan, be dragged into a war in Europe that had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor. And as you say, the question is, does the war make sense or not? But the impulse to drag your heels against a commemoration that leads in political directions you don't want to go, that's a pretty broad one. And so my Lindbergh analogy is not just something I made up off the top of my head. And by the way, I don't think Lindbergh was not a patriot. I think he was a very patriotic person, but he had strong and he volunteered and wanted to serve in World War II and was not allowed to by the Roosevelt administration. But
right, although if you're using him as an icon of isolationism, I think, of course, he has these other connotations which somewhat blur the point you're trying to make, and But anyway, I mean, I've written about evolutionary psychology and the evolution of the retributive impulse, and one of the first things I did after 9/11 was wrote a piece for Slate saying, just remember, the retributive impulse was designed by natural selection for a particular context in which it generally did serve your interests, and it often does serve our interests now to exercise a retributive impulse. But the atmosphere it was designed for was a small hunter-gatherer society lacking firearms, okay? And I just made the simple point that let's be careful, and I didn't recommend for or against any specific policy. I just said, let's be careful how we exercise our retributive impulse. And such was the environment after 9/11 that I got seriously tarred, even for just saying what seemed to me almost, common sense. But anyway, that's what I think the real stakes are when you want to see a lot more in the way of commemoration of 9/11, because I think. I think the invasion of Iraq depended heavily on its public support for emotional reactions and not rational thought. And the discourse in support of the war was, and this may be true of all run-ups to all wars. It probably is. But the discourse by those, the rhetoric by those who wanted to invade was very carefully engineered to play on various kinds of emotions, and in my mind, kind of short-circuit rational thought.
That, I have to say, you look back on that, and the way our case for this war was often made, that's very discreditable.
That's
discreditable.
Very what?
The case for war against Iraq was a hard and complicated case with a lot of contingencies, and it would, in order to mobilize political support, a lot of things were said by the president and others that shouldn't have been said, and that the way the president led the country to war, I think, sustained, enabled, encapsulated a lot of the bad decision making that made the war so frustrating and disappointing, and maybe ultimately unsuccessful and wasteful. And when you look back on, had the president made a more careful case, had he worked harder to bring his political opponents into the decision making, we would have had a more. Maybe we would never have gone to war at all. I tend to think we still would have, but I think we would have done so in a more intelligent and ultimately more successful way. And so yes, the kind of restraint that you and Schmidt were speaking for, I think it's smart, and I think it has a place in the councils of government. I don't want to see it. I think in this case it should not ultimately have governed, but it should have been heard. And there's a credit to you and to him. It's also true though that to write off retribution is as much a real factor in the relations between nations as it is between the relations of human beings. And Iraq really was a tremendous danger. And I think that people on the liberal side need to maybe reconnect with their memories of the years 1998, 1999, 2000, to remember when they thought the other way from the way they do now. And my guess is that in 2009, 2010, that they are going to think a different way again from the way they think today.
Okay, well, much of the first half of what you just said I agree with, so this gives us a chance to close on a kind of note of agreement.
Well, let's not get carried away.
No, you're right. I should have caught myself in mid-sentence. No, that qualified as a kind of note of agreement, the first half of what you just said. Well, the quasi mea culpa part. I mean, I wouldn't go that far, but the mea culpa part.
Well, I speak. Sorry, I don't make mea culpas because I only speak for myself, and I think that one of the things that is one of the reasons I like living in Washington is it's full of people who disagree with you who've also studied issues very closely and are very smart and thoughtful, and it's always like anytime you don't listen to people who disagree with you, you're going to make less intelligent. You're going to make less intelligent decisions in your own mind. And that's what the process of governance is supposed to be about. It's having to make your best case, accept the fiercest criticism, submit it to a rational, informed public, not use cheap arguments, and accept your losses when they come.
That's right, and I think the internet in a lot of ways works against that because of the much discussed preaching to the choir phenomenon on a lot of blogs and so on. So we are trying to exert countervailing influence by doing things like
leading
this.
By example.
Leading by example. And thanks a lot, Dave. We could have talked a lot longer.
We've talked probably too long as it is, and I've exhausted people's
I'm sure there's at this point no one watching, but we'll do a kind of test. If there's anybody watching, mention the word asparagus.
Maybe it's like the Michael Kinsley rule at this point. So if anyone is watching, please email Bob, and he will give you $50.
Yeah. Mike famously, in contending that no one actually reads books, he took he went into a bookstore and he wrote a little note saying if you...
The Strobe Talbot's Deadly Gambits, and he put his business card into 100 copies of it. Because Walter Mondale had mentioned in the 1984 Democratic debate, so the copies whizzed out of stores, and he put his card in like page 187 of 100 copies. If you find this card before such and such a date, please call Michael Kinsley for a $50 reward. And he got no calls.
I think it was maybe more like 10.
I'm adjusting for inflation.
A little more generous. He might have found out that people do read books. Who knows? Okay. Well, anyway, this was good, and I appreciate your taking the time. Let's do it again,
Bye,
David.
Bob. Thanks for kicking it around with me. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.